There was a time when this story felt simple. A rural family, a quiet life, a porch where days passed slowly, almost invisibly to the outside world. And then something changed. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, steadily, until what was once private became public, and what was once stable became uncertain. Now we are left with a different kind of question. Not how the story began, but why it still hasn't ended. Because even now, long after the loudest moments faded, there are signs, subtle, fragmented, difficult to verify, that the situation is still moving beneath the surface. Whispers instead of headlines, rumors instead of updates, silence where clarity should be. And that silence is not empty. It is crowded with speculation. Some people claim there are still individuals trying to help quietly, away from cameras, away from attention. Others suggest something more troubling, that even after everything, there are still people attempting to benefit from what remains of this family's story. That is where the tone shifts, because this is no longer just about what happened. It is about what continues. And what continues is harder to define. There are no clear timelines anymore. No confirmed updates that settle the situation. Only fragments, conversations, secondhand reports, small glimpses that raise more questions than they answer. And at the center of it all, the same issue remains. Value. Not emotional value. Not human value. But perceived value. Because somehow, even now, pieces of this family's life are still considered useful, still considered worth something. And that creates a discomfort that is difficult to ignore. Because if a story continues to generate attention after the people at its center have lost stability, then the story itself has taken on a life separate from them. It no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the audience. And that is where things begin to fracture. Because once a story detaches from the people it represents, it becomes something else. It becomes narrative. And narrative does not require resolution. It only requires continuation. Now consider what that means, hey. A family once seen together, now separated. A story once driven by visibility, now sustained by uncertainty. A situation where even absence becomes content. No new footage. No confirmed updates. And yet the discussion continues. That alone should raise a question. Why? Why does attention remain, even when information does not? Because attention does not always follow truth. It follows momentum. And momentum, once built, does not stop easily. It shifts. It adapts. It finds new angles. And sometimes, it continues even when it no longer serves the people it began with. Now look at the emotional center of this. Because behind every discussion, every theory, every speculation, there is a reality that remains mostly unseen. A family adjusting to something they did not choose. Separation, change, loss of routine, loss of familiarity, and perhaps most importantly, loss of control. Because control is rarely discussed directly, but it is always present. Who decides what happens next? Who speaks for them? Who knows the truth? Right now, the answer is unclear, and that uncertainty creates space. Space for speculation, space for assumption, space for people to step in and fill the silence with their own version of events. And that is where things become dangerous. Because when truth is absent, narrative expands. And not all narratives are neutral. Some are driven by belief, some by bias, some by something else entirely. Now step back for a moment. Before all of this, before the attention, before the involvement of outsiders, there was a family that existed without this level of exposure. They had challenges, They had limitations, but they also had structure, a known environment, a known routine, a known way of living. Now compare that to the present. Unclear locations, unclear conditions, unclear communication. And that contrast matters, because stability is not just about physical safety. It is about predictability. And when predictability disappears, even small uncertainties begin to feel larger. Now consider another layer: public perception. There are those who believe the situation ultimately improved, that intervention, attention, and external involvement led to better outcomes. There are others who believe the opposite, that what began as attention turned into disruption, and that disruption led to consequences that cannot easily be reversed. Both perspectives exist. Both are argued, but neither is fully proven. Because the most important details, the current reality of the family, remain largely unseen. And that brings us back to the core issue. We are looking at a story that continues without clear access to its outcome. And that creates tension, because people want resolution. They want to know, are they safe? Are they together? Are they better off? But those answers are not easily available. So instead, what fills the gap is interpretation. And interpretation is rarely consistent. Now consider the emotional weight of that. A situation where the people at the center are no longer visible, but the discussion about them continues. Where updates are uncertain, but opinions are constant. Where concern exists, but clarity does not. And in that space, something else emerges: fatigue. Because over time, unresolved stories do not just create curiosity. They create exhaustion. People begin to disengage, not because they no longer care, but because they no longer know what is real. And when that happens, the story enters a different phase. Not active attention, but passive memory. Still present, still discussed, but no longer grounded in confirmed reality. And yet, even in that state, it continues. Because something about it remains unresolved. Something about it still feels unfinished. And that is why this moment matters. Not because of what is being shown, but because of what is missing. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not what we can see. It is what we can't. And right now, what we can't see is exactly what keeps this from ending. Before we go further, consider this carefully. If a story continues without clarity, who benefits from that continuation? And more importantly, who doesn't? Comment one word. Continue if you believe this story still needs to be followed. Stop if you believe it has already gone too far. Or unsure if you think the truth is still out of reach. Because what comes next depends entirely on how we choose to look at what remains. When a story refuses to end, it usually means one of two things. Either something important is still unfolding, or something important was never fully understood in the first place. And in this case, both possibilities seem to exist at the same time. Because what we are looking at now is not a clear continuation. It is a fragmented aftermath. Pieces of information appear, then disappear. Claims are made, then questioned. People speak, then go silent. And in between those moments, something else grows. Interpretation. But interpretation without structure creates distortion. So the next step is not to follow every claim. It is to slow down and examine the pattern underneath them. Because patterns reveal intention more clearly than statements do. Start with this. Multiple sources, unverified, indirect, inconsistent, suggest that there are still individuals involved in the situation behind the scenes. Some are described as trying to help. Others are described in much harsher terms. But notice what is missing. Names are unclear. Actions are unclear. Outcomes are unclear. What remains is tone. And tone alone is not evidence. So the correct question is not, is this true? The correct question is, what can actually be confirmed? Right now, very little. And that matters. Because when information cannot be verified, the risk of projection increases. People begin to fill gaps with assumption. An assumption, repeated enough times, begins to feel like fact. Now look at how quickly that happens. A suggestion becomes a possibility. A possibility becomes a belief. A belief becomes a position. And once positions are formed, people defend them. Not because they are certain, but because they feel invested. That is how narratives solidify, even without proof. Now step back again, because there is a deeper layer here. Why would people remain interested in a situation that no longer provides clear updates? Why does attention persist when visibility decreases? Because the structure of this story has changed. It is no longer driven by events. It is driven by unresolved tension. And unresolved tension is powerful. It creates a loop. People return to the story not for answers, but for closure. But closure is not being provided. So the loop continues. Now consider another dimension. Motivation. There are claims that some individuals are still engaging with the situation for personal gain. Not necessarily in obvious ways. Not always through direct monetization, but through association. Through proximity to the narrative. Through being connected to something that still holds attention. And this is where the analysis becomes uncomfortable. Because attention itself has value, even without money attached. Visibility is currency. Association is currency. Influence is currency. And when a story generates those things, it attracts behavior that seeks to access them. Not always maliciously, but not always ethically either. Now ask a difficult question. If the family is no longer publicly visible, but the discussion about them continues, who controls that discussion? The answer is simple. Not them. And that imbalance is critical, because control over narrative shapes perception, and perception shapes outcome. Now think about the individuals involved. There are those who previously documented, shared, and interacted with the family directly. Some of them are still present in discussions. Others are not. Some speak occasionally. Others remain silent. And that silence itself becomes interpreted. People ask, why are they quiet? What are they waiting for? Do they know something? But silence does not always indicate strategy. Sometimes it indicates limitation. Sometimes it indicates uncertainty. Sometimes it indicates withdrawal. But in an environment built on speculation, silence rarely stays neutral. It gets filled. Now bring this back to the family, because everything else is secondary. At the center of this are individuals who are now largely removed from public view. That alone changes everything, because visibility creates accountability. When people are seen, their conditions can be observed. When they are not, observation becomes impossible. And without observation, only two things remain: trust or doubt. And right now, the environment leans toward doubt. Not necessarily because something is wrong, but because nothing is confirmed. Now consider the emotional impact of that. A situation where people care, but cannot verify. Where concern exists, but cannot be directed. Where attention continues, but cannot reach its subject. That creates a specific kind of frustration. And frustration, over time, turns into division. People begin to separate into groups. Those who believe things are improving. Those who believe things are worsening. Those who believe the truth is being hidden. And those who believe there is nothing left to know. Each group builds its own interpretation. And those interpretations begin to conflict. Now the story is no longer just about the family. It becomes about the audience, about belief systems, about who is right. And at that point, something important is lost. Focus. Because once attention shifts from the subject to the argument, the subject becomes secondary. And that is what appears to be happening now. The discussion has outgrown the visibility of the people it began with. Now consider the ethical layer. If people continue to engage with a story that they cannot verify, what responsibility do they carry? Do they step back? Do they continue asking questions? Do they attempt to intervene? There is no simple answer, because each option carries risk. Stepping back may reduce harm, but it may also reduce awareness. Continuing to engage may maintain attention, but it may also perpetuate speculation. Intervening may feel helpful, but it may also create further disruption. This is the paradox. There is no action that guarantees a positive outcome, only actions that shift the balance of risk. Now add one more element. Time. Because time changes perception. What felt urgent months ago may feel distant now. What felt clear may now feel uncertain. And what felt active may now feel unresolved. But unresolved does not mean inactive. It means incomplete. And incomplete stories tend to linger. They do not close. They echo. Now think about the phrase that keeps appearing in different forms. It's not over. What does that actually mean? It could mean there are still developments. It could mean there are still consequences. Or it could mean something simpler, that people are not ready to let it end. Because ending a story requires acceptance. Acceptance that not everything will be known. Acceptance that not everything can be fixed. Acceptance that some outcomes remain unclear. And that is difficult, especially when the story involves vulnerability. Now return to the central issue again, the family. Because everything else, speculation, discussion, interpretation, exists around them. But they are no longer at the center of visibility, and that creates a disconnect. A story being told without direct access to its subject, and that is where caution becomes necessary. Because without direct confirmation, every statement carries uncertainty, and uncertainty should slow conclusions, not accelerate them. So the question now becomes more precise. Not what is happening, but what can responsibly be said about what is happening? And the answer is limited. There are indications of continued activity. There are suggestions of ongoing involvement. There are claims of future developments. But there is no comprehensive, verified picture. And that limitation must be acknowledged, because ignoring it leads to distortion. Now consider one final angle. Expectation. Many people expect a moment of clarity, a final update, a definitive answer, something that explains everything. But not all stories provide that. Some remain open, not because they are still unfolding in a visible way, but because the information needed to close them is not accessible. And when that happens, the story does not end. It stabilizes in uncertainty. That is where this appears to be now. Not active resolution, not complete silence, but something in between. A state where fragments continue to appear, but never fully connect. And that brings us to the next question. If clarity never fully arrives, what should happen next? Should attention continue? Should it fade? Or should it change? Comment one word. Watch if you believe attention should continue carefully. Step back if you believe distance is now the better choice. Or wait if you believe the only responsible action is patience. Because what happens next is not just about the story. It is about how people choose to engage with it. At this point, the story is no longer moving forward in a straight line. It is circling, returning to the same questions, revisiting the same uncertainties. repeating the same concerns, but with slightly different details each time. And that circular motion is not accidental. It is what happens when a situation loses direct visibility but retains emotional weight. Because without new verified information, the only thing left to process is what already happened. So the focus shifts from events to interpretation, from facts to meaning. And meaning is where things begin to diverge. Because people are no longer asking only, what happened? They are asking something more difficult. What does this say about what should have happened? That question introduces judgment, and judgment introduces division. Now the conversation splits into layers. One layer looks at outcomes. Were conditions improved? Was safety increased? Were needs addressed? Another layer looks at process. How were decisions made? Who had authority? Who influenced the outcome? And a third layer, often the most emotional, looks at intention. Was this done to help? Was it done for gain? Was it a mix of both? These layers overlap, but they do not align easily, because a positive intention can still lead to a negative outcome, and a structured process can still produce harm. That complexity is where most discussions begin to break down. People choose one layer, and then defend it. Now step into that tension, because it reveals something important. This story is no longer just about a family. It has become a case study in what happens when private lives intersect with public attention. And once something becomes a case study, it changes how people engage with it. They analyze, they compare, they project, and sometimes they lose sight of the individuals inside it. Now consider the phrase that keeps resurfacing in different forms. They were promised something better. That phrase matters because it establishes expectation. An expectation creates a benchmark. If the outcome does not clearly exceed the original condition, then the promise becomes questionable. But here's the complication. What defines better? Is it material improvement? Is it safety? Is it autonomy? Is it stability? Those are not the same thing. And in many situations, improving one can reduce another. For example, increasing supervision may improve safety, but reduce independence. Changing environment may improve conditions, but disrupt familiarity. Introducing structure may improve oversight, but limit freedom. So when people say better, they are often referring to different outcomes. And that is why agreement becomes difficult. Now bring this back to the present. There are claims that some members of the family are in structured environments, facilities, supervised settings, places designed to provide care. On the surface, that suggests increased oversight. But oversight alone does not define well-being, because well-being also includes connection, routine, familiarity, and those elements are harder to measure. Now ask a simple but uncomfortable question. If a situation becomes safer, but less familiar, is it better? There is no universal answer, only perspective. And perspective depends on what someone values more. Now consider the emotional cost of transition. Because any major change, especially one that involves separation, creates an adjustment period. For individuals who rely heavily on routine, that adjustment can be significant. New environments, new people, new expectations. Even when those changes are intended to help, they require adaptation. And adaptation is not immediate. It takes time, sometimes more time than observers expect. Now think about how this looks from the outside. People see before and after. They compare two states, but they do not always see the middle. The transition, the uncertainty, the process of adjusting. And that is where most of the real impact occurs. Now consider another layer. Communication. Right now, there is very limited direct communication from the family themselves. That absence is critical, because without direct voice, interpretation increases. People speak about them instead of hearing from them. And that creates a gap between reality and perception. And in that gap, narratives form. Some hopeful, some critical, some uncertain, but all of them incomplete. Now examine the role of those who were previously involved more directly. There are expectations placed on them to explain, to update, to clarify. But those expectations may not align with reality. Because once a situation enters legal, medical, or institutional structures, information often becomes restricted. Not necessarily hidden, but controlled. And that control limits what can be publicly shared. So silence does not always indicate avoidance. It can indicate limitation. But again, without clarity, silence is interpreted. Now look at how quickly interpretation turns into assumption. If someone does not speak, people ask why. If someone speaks vaguely, people question what is being withheld. If someone provides partial information, people fill in the rest. And that cycle reinforces itself. Now step back again, because there is a deeper pattern here. This story highlights a broader issue. What happens when attention arrives faster than structure? When visibility increases before safeguards are in place? When multiple individuals engage with a situation without a unified framework? The result is fragmentation. Different people acting with different goals. Different interpretations of what help looks like. Different methods. And without coordination, those differences collide. Now consider what happens after that collision. Accountability becomes unclear. Responsibility becomes shared, but not evenly. And outcomes become difficult to trace back to a single source. That is what makes this situation so difficult to resolve. There is no single point of failure, only a series of actions that interacted. Now bring this back to the present moment. There are still questions about potential legal developments. Possibilities, not confirmations. Some believe additional accountability may emerge. Others believe the situation has already reached its conclusion. But again, there is no clear timeline. And without a timeline, expectations become unstable. People anticipate events that may not occur, or may occur later than expected. And when expectations are not met, frustration increases. Now consider how that frustration expresses itself. Through debate, through accusation, through speculation, and sometimes through disengagement. Because when a story remains unresolved for too long, some people stop following it entirely. Not because they no longer care, but because they no longer see a path to clarity. Now here is the critical point. A story does not need to be actively developing to still have impact. Even in its current state, fragmented, uncertain, partially hidden, it continues to influence perception. It influences how people think about similar situations, about exposure, about help, about responsibility. So even without new events, it remains relevant. But relevance does not equal resolution, and that distinction matters. Now ask one final question for this part. If clarity is limited, and outcomes are still being interpreted, what is the responsible way to engage with a story like this? Is it to continue analyzing every fragment? Is it to step back and wait for confirmed information? Or is it to shift focus entirely, away from speculation and toward principle? Because at some point, the focus must move from what happened to what should be learned. Comment one word. Analyze if you think every detail still needs to be examined. Pause if you think waiting is the only responsible move. Or learn if you think the focus should shift to what this situation reveals about bigger issues. Because how this story is handled from here matters just as much as how it began. At some point, every unresolved story reaches a threshold. Not where it ends, but where continuing the same way no longer adds clarity. Only noise. And this is where that threshold begins to appear. Because the facts are no longer expanding in a meaningful way. The same names circulate. The same claims repeat. The same questions remain unanswered. And when repetition replaces progression, something shifts. The story stops informing and starts echoing. That distinction matters, because echo creates the illusion of movement without actually moving forward. Now consider what that means here. There are still conversations about accountability, still speculation about potential outcomes, still debate about who did what and why. But without new verified information, those conversations begin to overlap. They stop adding new insight. They reinforce existing positions. And that creates a closed loop. Now bring the focus back to the core issue. Not the noise, not the speculation, but the reality that remains. A family that is no longer visible in the way it once was. A situation that has changed, but not been fully explained. And a public that is still trying to understand something it cannot directly see. That combination creates tension, because people want resolution. But resolution requires access. And access, in this case, is limited. So the question changes. It is no longer, what exactly is happening right now? It becomes, what can responsibly be concluded given what is actually known? And the answer is careful. There was involvement. There were decisions. There were consequences. Some intended, some not. And now, there is distance. Distance between the public and the people at the center of the story. Distance between what is known and what is assumed. And distance between attention and understanding. That distance should not be filled quickly. It should be respected, because filling it too fast leads to distortion. Now one final consideration. Not every story needs a dramatic ending to matter. Some matter because of what they reveal along the way. About attention, about responsibility, about how easily intention and outcome can separate. And maybe that is where this stands now. Not fully resolved, not fully visible, but already carrying enough weight to change how similar stories are approached in the future. Before moving forward, answer this honestly. If new information never comes, would that change how you see what has already happened? Comment one word. Yes, if your perspective would shift. No, if your conclusion is already fixed. Or maybe if you think understanding is still evolving. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is how it changes the person watching it. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.